Glory to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one true God. Amen. Welcome to Urho the Way, an online outreach ministry to disseminate the love of triune God through the witness and life of the Syriac Orthodox Church. My name is Father Renjan Mathew. We are so excited to introduce to you this evening Dr. Jeanne-Nicole Mellon Saint-Laurent. Dr. Saint-Laurent is a scholar of Syriac Studies and Associate Professor of Marquette University, Wisconsin. She is specialized in hagiography and sacred narrative. Dr. Saint-Laurent is the author and co-author of many books like Missionary Stories and the Formation of Syriac Churches, The History of More Behnam and Sarah, The Gateway of the Syriac Saints, and so on. This conversation highlights the missionary stories and the formation of the Syriac Churches, the mission of St. Thomas to India, the role of hagiography in the Syriac tradition, and we'll talk about the online database projects like Gateway to the Syriac Saints, and so on. Let us welcome Dr. Jeanne-Nicole Mellon Saint-Laurent.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laurent, for being with us, and welcome again to Urho the Way, conversation on Syriac Christianity. We are so excited that you are here. So tell us about your academic journey. What made you drew into the Syriac studies and early Christianity?
Well, thank you for the question. I studied classics and theology as an undergraduate at Gonzaga University many years ago. And then when I started my master's program in early Christian studies at the University of Notre Dame, I had the opportunity to expand my language training from beyond Latin and Greek to Syriac. And before that, I didn't know anything about that. And I had a wonderful teacher, Professor Joseph Amar, who was a Maronite priest from the Maronite tradition. And he taught me, and I was absolutely captivated by the beauty of the language. And for me, it was a whole new insight, a whole new way of understanding the Christian tradition, to look at the Semitic roots, Syriac as a dialect of Aramaic, very close, of course, to the language that Jesus spoke. And so for me, as a young graduate student, I realized that this was the tradition that I wanted to make for the focus of my own studies. And I realized also that there was so much work to do. And I was fascinated in particular with the lives of the saints. I had always been interested in the stories of the saints. I myself am from the Catholic tradition, but I realized there was a whole other world, a whole other catalog, hierarchy of holy men and women that I never heard of coming from the Syriac Church. And so I really was interested in focusing on that and studying that. And so then I started working with Dr. Susan Ashbrook-Harvey, who was my doctoral advisor at Brown. I went on to study with her. And then I finished up there and wrote a dissertation on hagiography in the Syriac tradition.
That's really interesting. You ended up with Dr. Susan Ashbrook-Harvey. You did your PhD with her. So tell us about your unique interest in hagiography and sacred narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always been intrigued by the unique genre of hagiography, because on the one hand, there's stories, and so they tell the stories of the holy men and women, but they don't just tell us about the people themselves. That is to say, they don't just tell us about the saints themselves, they also tell us about the communities who venerated the saints. And so I was really interested to ask the question, how can we study the lives of the saints, not just for insights into the people who are commemorated in these stories, but also the communities that commemorated to them. And so for me, it was always those two wings together, that I had an idea that maybe it would be an interesting way to look at the history of Christianity, not just through the lens of doctrinal treatises or controversies and theological disputes, but what about the stories of the holy people? And in fact, by studying them comparatively, I was hoping that I could gain some more understanding about these communities and the symbols that are shown in the lives of these holy people, what those symbols also teach us about the communities themselves. So that was my angle, my interest. And of course, I was especially interested in the lives of holy women too, which had been neglected. And I thought that could be another interesting angle. So I had a variety of interests.
That's interesting. Dr. Susan Harvey, she also had some special interest in the unknown women, the holy women of the church, especially in the Syriac tradition. So it's to hear that many people are coming up with studying the women from their perspective, and I believe we can discuss more about that. We can discuss about hagiography, reading hagiography in a more inclusive language later at this conversation. So tell us about your PhD dissertation on apostolic memories, religious differentiation, and the construct of orthodoxy in Syriac missionary literature. That was the long title.
Yeah, that is exactly a very long title, way too long. I published it later on as a book, as you know, which you mentioned later. And I tried to clean it up much more in the book version. But one thing that I noticed in my studies of the Syriac hagiography was they had a particular interest of promoting missionary saints. And of course, this isn't particular to Syriac Christianity. The Christian church itself was a missionary church all the way back to the beginnings with the apostles, Paul and all the apostles. And the idea that every apostle was commissioned by Jesus to go to a different region and to bring the Christian message, the Christian religion. That's a tradition that all of the churches in early Christianity share. But in the Syriac church, what was interesting to me was that the missionary saint itself had a particular exaggerated, embellished form and commemoration, not just in the early stories of the Syriac church, but even in the later churches, in the later periods. So I wanted to look at how the earliest figure of the missionary saint, which was the most important, was St. Thomas, the apostle to India, and how he became the prototype, as it were, for all subsequent missionary stories, like the story of the teaching of the apostle Addai, the story of Marmari, which are more, so St. Thomas and Mar Addai and Marmari, those stories were more elaborated narratives. But you see it also in later hagiography from the 6th and 7th centuries with the shorter episodic stories that I found in St. John of Ephesus' Lives of the Eastern Saints. So what I wanted to do was to see how the initial literary themes, theological themes that were present already in the stories of St. Thomas, how those reappear and get reused by the communities in different ways to present an argument of their orthodoxy. So what I tried to show was that the missionary saint is vital for every church, for every community, for every monastery, to show a connection back to Jesus. And so communities, when they were trying to show their orthodoxy, present a history of their past, the missionary saint was a vital link in that process. And that's what I tried to show. And it was really interesting to see how the symbol, in one sense, did remain the same, but it got reworked and reconfigured and modified for different purposes in the later churches as well. But the memory of the missionary saint was always very strong in the Syriac church. And of course, the Syriac Church grew through the trade routes all the way to India. So not just the missionary saint, but the merchant saint, like Saint Thomas was. It's believed that Christianity did reach India and the East by way of the trade routes. And so it makes absolutely beautiful sense that they would dress their Saint Thomas, that they would garb him in the cloaks of a merchant. It makes sense because that's what they were too. So you start to see the link between the apostles themselves, the saints themselves, but also the values of the people who were promoting these saints.
We are specifically, thank you for that elaborate, summarizing your work, and that led to the book itself. So we are interested more in the mission of Saint Thomas, Afghan, China, Northern India. So tell us more about that,
Yeah. So it's an interesting, it's a wonderful, rich tradition, both that has both literary artifacts as well as cultural artifacts, objects in churches, that is to say. So there's all kinds of different lenses through which we can understand this, and commemorating or culminating in the tradition of Thomas being buried in India at the site of his martyrdom. As a matter of fact, my late father had gone to India at one point and was met by the Christians there who showed him the tomb of Saint Thomas. And so, the living tradition that's so precious to the Saint Thomas Christians, all the way back to the more ancient tradition. And it's interesting too, from a sort of more academic point of view, to see that St. Thomas was, and the stories of St. Thomas. So you have the Acts of Thomas. That's the longest text that describes Thomas journeying to India. And all along the way, what he's doing is he's converting kings, princes. So the story talks about Thomas being commemorated by Jesus. He's commissioned by Jesus to go to India, and he doesn't want to go, which is an interesting theme. In the beginning, the story talks about him being an unwilling apostle. He doesn't want to go to India, but he must, because that's his vocation. That's what Christ has picked for him. And so the story goes, he's actually sold into slavery. According to the Acts of Thomas, he's sold into slavery and joins up with a carpenter, with a tradesman, and he's sort of undercover as the missionary saint. And so he comes to the first kingdom, which it's not exactly clear in the story where exactly these locations are, that it's disputed. Some people think what was meant by India in this text was probably what would be considered northern India today. It's a little bit hard to know, mostly because the Acts of Thomas itself was a composite text. So there was earlier portions, then they got added to and elaborated upon. But the main theme was that he was converting kingdoms, and he would come with the message of Christianity that would overturn societies. And so the themes was that he would come and the message of Christianity was disruptive to the local kingdom, and people resisted. But he converts their hearts. And so in one instance, the first act, he converts a princess and a prince of the kingdom to Christianity. And along with them comes others then. And so one after another, kingdoms convert. And so the idea that the missionary apostle, like St. Thomas, started coming into a community and then converts the king, and then it sort of converts the whole society along with it. That's the theme. And what's prioritized too are care of the poor. So throughout the story, Thomas is, for instance, there's a story where he's given money from the king to build a palace. And instead of building the palace, he's giving it away to the poor. And he says, well, I'm building a palace in the kingdom of heaven. So the idea that the stress on care of the poor and also on healing all along the way, just as Jesus says in the Gospels, St. Thomas, his twin, he's healing body and soul. And so the conversion of the heart is always with the body too. Everything goes along. And so it's a very beautiful text. And but the hard part is that it's not always exactly clear historically where he was going. And so scholars have tried to recreate that. Certainly, though, it attests, in my mind, it's an attestation that Christianity did come to India through these trade routes. And there certainly was some connection to St. Thomas, even if we can't get an exact pinpoint. And because it's such an ancient tradition, going all the way back to the early church.
Yeah. And many of the things are kind of controversial as well, right?
Yeah, St. Thomas was also the Acts of Thomas was also a text that was popular in what the later church would call heretical groups, like the Manichaeans and other groups. So that was an interesting piece too. He was apostle that everybody wanted to connect to, and that's where the argument about orthodoxy comes into play, because of course the Orthodox Church will show that their story is the most in line with the tradition.
Yeah, thank you for that great elaborative reflection.
Yeah.
Here at Urho the Way, we have a weekly series of volunteer presented research called Walking the Way with the Saints. And you have
wonderful
work on the method of analysis in hagiography and how to approach hagiography. Maybe for the lay faithful while studying hagiography, and how should hagiography be used to help in disseminating the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question.
How to go about, working on these kind of projects.
Yes. Well, the wonderful thing is that each saint is unique. So hagiography, I like to think, if this is helpful as an analogy, I like to think of hagiography, the lives of the saints, are a literary counterpart to an icon. So in the same way in the church, as we have icons, we have pictures of the saints. And when you look at a picture of a saint, the picture teaches you something about that man or woman, whether it be through the symbols that he or she is holding, what they are dressed in. It's meant to pull you out of this world for a little bit and think about the next world. And so it's always important to remember that hagiography is not like a straightforward history. It's a sacred text. It's meant to bring the reader into the life of God through showing what it means to be a man or a woman of God. And so I think theologically, it's very powerful, because the lives of the saints teach us what we're capable of. It's this sense that no matter what you do, or no matter what you've done, with the love of God and with fidelity and faithfulness in God, anything is possible. And what's so wonderful about the saints too, so you have to see it in that light, I would say. So what the hagiographer is going to do is not tell us everything about the person's life. It's not a biography. It's an episodic, just a moment in the important parts, and then they will expand upon those important parts, embellish a little bit, but always with the view of showing how that person modeled God, because in the back of the text is always the life of Jesus and the apostles. And there's all different types of saints. And so when I teach this to my students, it's really wonderful for them to see You know, if you were a doctor, there were doctor saints, there were healing saints. If you were a soldier, there were soldier saints. If you were a sinful woman, their sinful women became great saints in the eyes of the church, monks, and so on. So there's all these different types, and they teach us and they challenge us even more so today, because the powerful thing too I've noticed is that the lives of the saints, we read them, but they are reading us too. By reading the lives of the saints, it causes us to reflect upon our own lives as Christians and think about where are the areas where God is calling us into holiness as a lay person or whatever. You know, like in the ancient world, they talked about distractions for the monks, that the different struggles that the monk would have in the ascetic life. Well, we have distractions too. I mean, in today's time, there's all kinds of distractions, and so there's a lot of analogies that can be drawn. So they're meant to inspire, and they're meant to be imitated too. It's not just meant, they're not just meant to be read, but they're meant, it's a call to imitation.
Thank you. And that helps like Christ through the sacred narrative of saints. So that really helps. I mean, so I was reading one of your a paper on Syriac hagiography literature. And these are your concluding remarks. Let me read that for our viewers. Syrian Christians identified the saints as their models of holiness, and they claimed them for their tradition through the composition, performance, and enhancement of hagiographic literature. The saints are a vital component of Syriac Christian theology. Hagiographic literature expresses this theology in vivid color with narrative and poetic text that engage the imagination and memory. Is there something in Syriac hagiographical text that you find unique from other in the kingdom? Is there a thing you have come across in the Syriac Orthodox world that you find interesting and wish that he or she would have been better known to the public and to the Syriac Orthodox people?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, I would say there's. Are you asking about a particular saint, or is sort of in a general sense what makes Syriac hagiography unique?
A particular saint. I mean, and we always talk about Saint Ephraim. I mean, but
yeah.
You are a person who who has in-depth knowledge on hagiography and sacred narratives.
Yes. Well, one of my favorite, there's a couple. Saint Simeon the Stylite, he's one of the most important saints of the Syriac Church. And he is in his own category. To think, so for viewers who aren't familiar with his story, he was a monk who, in an effort to devote himself more fully to God, stood on top of a pillar for most of his life, subduing his body and raising his soul to God. And the idea that a man would stand on a pillar as this sign literally staggered between heaven and earth is quite unique. I mean, this doesn't exist in other traditions. I mean, he was outside of what is outside of the city of Aleppo, what is now Aleppo today. And so that image of the Stylite saint is certainly one of my favorites from Syriac Christianity. But to counter Saint Simeon, who in many ways is a very theatrical image, I mean, who wouldn't find that a compelling image? There was also an emphasis on Syriac hagiography on anonymous holiness. So one of the most beautiful traditions in the Syriac Church is the story of the Syrian man of God. He lived in Edessa, this man of God, and it's a Syriac hagiography, which goes off in different forms to the Latin and Greek world, but its origins Syriac. And the story was that this was a prince from Rome who left Rome the night of his wedding because he wanted to live a life of poverty. He wanted to live a life of simplicity. So he journeys to Edessa, to Urho, and he lives as a beggar, and nobody knows who he is except the porter of the church. At night, the porter of the church sees the man of God praying and is moved by that. And it's only after his death that people realize who he was. And here he was, a prince and in beggar's clothes all along. And so I think that's a beautiful, beautiful, powerful image that holiness can be hidden. In fact, it can be all around us. So the story of in a city, you can find these things, that there could be a saint all around you if you know how to look for it. So that's certainly also one of my most favorite saints. And then one final, if I may, would be a story of a mother and a daughter, Mary and Euphemia. And this is from the later tradition, the 6th century tradition, John of Ephesus. Mary and Euphemia, a mother and a daughter who together care for the poor out of their own, the work of their hands. Together, they have all of these ministries going on outside of their house with tremendous energy. And so it's wonderful that there exists also an image of a married woman and her daughter participating in that. Some of my favorite saints.
Those are really interesting. Now, we have a term, Jacobite. For the Syriac Orthodox faithful in India, the term Jacobite, it's controversial elsewhere and is an essential part of our identity as Christians in Malankara. It is a term wholly accepted in a positive light and connecting our ancient community of Indian Christians is evangelized by St. Thomas to the Church of St. Jacob Bordeus and St. Severius, and ultimately the St. Peter's Holy See of Antioch. Would you say that the controversial usage of the term Jacobite by the adversaries of the Syriac Orthodox in the history to portray her as the new church rather than a rightful continuation is similar to other such historical examples of political framing to marginalize?
Yeah, well, I am quite, I'm a big, let's just say, I'm a big fan, for lack of a better word. I'm very enthusiastic about the stories of Jacob Barades. He's one of my favorite saints. And as you would know, I have a chapter on him in my book. Yeah. So, and I think it's interesting to consider him the man, to think of who Jacob Barades was. Before, it is certainly lamentable that the term Jacobite came to have this sort of negative idea, sort of saying the followers of the Jacobite church versus the followers of the Byzantine, the Church of the King or what have you. But the positive thing is that he's a wonderful man and an incredible person. So the stories of Jacob Barades tell us about this monk who was so committed to the Church of Severus of Antioch, to the Miaphysite Christological positions and all the bishops, and that he was indefatigable. He was traveling from village to village, monastery to monastery, ordaining priests, trying to keep these communities alive. And so again, if you think of him as a hero of your church, then it's a wonderful thing to be called a Jacobite, actually. And it's true in retrospect that the term had this negative connotation because there was some disputes happening between some of the leaders in the Syrian Orthodox Church. But in its origin, though, it's interesting, though, because later you'll see that it's not considered a put down anymore. That is to say, the church itself will reclaim Jacobite as a positive thing as the memory of Jacob Bar Hedayas is elevated. So in my book, I analyzed two different stories of his life, and what was so interesting was to see that the later version from the 8th century greatly expanded upon the first version, and you could see that the elaborations in the stories of Jacob Bar Hedayas showed how much respect and pride the church had, that at that point then they were quite proud to be called Jacobites. They took what was originally a sort of put down, reclaimed it for themselves, and then self-identified that way with great pride, as I understood it. Now, as for its propriety in the modern sort of ecclesiastical organization, that's perhaps a different question, but I think when you just focus on the figure of Jacob Bar Hedayas, he's a very inspiring saint and a very inspiring missionary saint.
Thank you. In the modern sense, we still use with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of with that heritage, despite being a persecuted community, though people made fun of that term, that is still part of the identity, and we hold that to very much to our hearts and bottom of our hearts. So could you speak about the ground level presence of Miaphysite faithful during the years of Saint Severus' patriarchal tenure? You mentioned that though the bishops were replaced, many of the faithful remained loyal to the non-Chalcedon movement, and though they experienced the most violent in the Oriental provinces, they found a haven in numerous monasteries and their partisans. And what was the real presence of Miaphysite faithful during the time of Saint Severus?
As far as actual numbers, I'm not. I hesitate to give an exact number, but it was certainly a large number. That's for certain. And what we probably imagine is that it's the bishops understood, and the abbots of the monasteries, and those who were theologically trained, they understood the doctrinal controversies that were happening. But it's probably unrealistic to think that all the laity did, in the same way that even today, you're not going to get every person who's a faithful person coming to church doesn't necessarily have all the theology at his or her fingertips to rattle off. So that's why the fidelity to the bishop was so important. And you followed your bishop, even if it came at a cost. But the bishops themselves had to be extremely, like if you take a person like Jacob of Sarug, for instance, who was also of this same time, powerful homilist who would preach the Christology, for instance, very, very, very effectively to the faithful. So it had to come through the pulpit in that way too, so that they could understand. But it wasn't easy, and you can imagine that there was a lot of confusion too going on when you didn't really, perhaps not everybody understood what all of the fine points of theological, Christological articulations, but they could see that it was important to their leaders, and so they had to try to remain faithful to that. And there was a fear, as you see in the hagiography, there was a grave fear of being wrong. I mean, you can't understate that either. I mean, the faithful wanted to be on the side of orthodoxy. And so they were often willing to pay a price for that if necessary. It's a sad moment, if I may say so, in the history of the church, this moment where Christians were persecuting Christians in this way. And I don't know, honestly, any of this would matter anymore, to Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians. Would these still be issues today? Probably not, in my opinion. So maybe someday we'll get these things resolved. We can hope for that.
Yeah, I think, there are still issues. I mean, we'll look forward. We trust God, right?
Exactly.
So we talked about this, like you have a special interest in women in Syriac Orient and holy women of the church. And in the introduction of your dissertation, you pointed out that these texts were written by a group of males, elite males. So we are in the 21st century. Do you think a different lens is required when reading these hagiographies without rewriting the existing literary corpus? How may the instructors in the church, the priests, Sunday school teachers, or those who are, instructing, or those who are preaching, how can they interpret such texts to be more inclusive for all?
Well, that's a great question. I think the most important thing, luckily you have the greatest saint in the church is Mary, is the Mother of God. And so you can begin with her if you want to think of inclusivity. And the traditions of Mary, of the Virgin Mary in the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syriac Church, are so incredible and so rich. If you study the presentation, for instance, of Mary in the hymns of Ephraim, nobody else in Ephraim's time in the 4th century has anything that compares to his portrait of Mary. So you can just begin with that and have an amazing witness that she is the most important person who has ever lived, because it's through Mary that Jesus gets his humanity. And in the hymns of Ephraim, so beautifully, what you can encounter is a person. Yes, she's the Mother of God, but she's also a model of devotion. So Mary teaches us how to approach her Son. She teaches us the wonder with which we must approach the incarnation that she experienced in such a unique way, because it happened within her own womb. So, that would be that's the most important, I think, place to begin. But there's many. Just because the lives of the saints were written by men doesn't mean that they still can tell us a lot about women, and it's actually quite remarkable. If you take a look at the project that I worked on with my colleague, Syriaca.org, there's so many women saints in that catalog. Martyrs. There were martyr saints. So one of the most popular types of female saints was the Virgin Martyr, the Daughters of the Covenant. These women who took vows of celibacy, vows of pledging their single-hearted devotion to God. They called themselves they were like the bride of Christ. Christ became the one to whom they were totally committed, and then they would have to pay a price sometimes in martyrdom. So there's a very powerful tradition of the Virgin Martyrs, for instance. But then also, as I said, there's also ordinary people, families, and young people too. There's the text that I translated with my colleague Kyle Smith, Behnam and Sarah. That's the story of a brother and a sister saint that comes, which is a fascinating. It's a fascinating story because it shows how even sometimes in families, and that the tradition is that their own father put them to death because they were Christians. And so it's a painful theme to think that this could cause this sort of familial division. But on the other hand, if you think about it, it shows that we have this tradition that even a child, even a young person who's devoted to Christ can be a witness, can be a sign of holiness, and then become a powerful figure. So Behnam and Sarah become very important saints, especially in the Syrian Orthodox Church of Northern Iraq, where there's the monastery there to them. So there's just a wide array of types, and I think I just finished translating the story of Saint Mary of Egypt, which is her tradition exists in the Greek and Latin tradition as well, but now it was also very popular in the Syriac church. So her life was translated from Greek into, there's our project, from Greek into Syriac. And that was a story of a woman who was actually a prostitute for the first 28 years of her life in Alexandria. And she has an amazing conversion experience when she goes to Jerusalem and sees an icon of the Mother of God. She sees an icon of the Mother of God, and at that moment, she commits herself to a life of penance. And she flees into the desert to live out the rest of her life, basically as a monk. And she's nobody knows she's there until a monk called by the name of Zazimos finds her when she's a very old woman, and she tells him her story. And what you see is that the story of the repentant the repentant woman who becomes this great lover of Christ, very, very powerful, very, very beautiful, and the friendship that exists between Zazimos and Saint Mary too, because I think that's also another really important thing that's worth noting about hagiography, is that it gives us also not just a vision of single individuals, but also new types of friendships, new types of friendships, new types of bonds between people who both share this devotion to Christ as well. So it's a whole. It's a presentation which considers the whole community to be transformed, not just about one person.
Thank you. So we just mentioned, I tried to share the screen. Would you speak a little bit about your work with the Gateway to the Syriac Saints and the Qadishe projects? So I'm just going to share the screen so that the viewers can see what all are available. Many times the resources, the materials are not available, especially for Sunday school students. And we can see that many people are experimenting a lot of things innovative way. We can see Jobin is saying what their youth group is doing this afternoon. I mean, these are all awesome things. So would you mind talking about, these projects?
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to. Well, the digital humanities is a wonderful new field that's been growing in the past 15 years. Digital humanities takes the technology of computing and what's called linked open data, the way that data can connect so that databases can be joined together so that information can be shared, takes that technology and joins it with the rigor of traditional academic scholarship to create new portals for research. And so my colleagues and I, this project was headed up originally by Dr. David Michelson, who's at Vanderbilt, had a vision of creating a portal for Syriac studies. And this is an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing project. But I worked on the Saints module, as it's called, Qadishe, as well as the Bibliotheca, Hagiographica, Syriac Electronica, which is a catalog of the saints' lives. So the Qadishe is the people themselves with short descriptions and of many different saints. When I put that together, my base was, I used the book Saint-Syriac by Jean-Marie Fier to have short entries on all the saints that he discusses in that book, together with some further bibliography. And then the other database is the texts themselves. So if you want to see on the hagiography panel. So you have the saints and then the hagiography on the far right there. And there's many different texts, some of which haven't even been edited yet. So the idea was to put this project available for free, so that people would have a starting point for further research. And so you can see all these different saints. So you can see just how many different, each entry there, if you've got Abraham Kudanoya there, represents a different text about that saint. And so you can even see how one saint can have many stories or homilies that were written about him or her. So if you're interested, even just on the devotion to different people in the Syriac tradition, it's a wonderful place to start. The saint with the most entries is Mary. So there were more things written about the Virgin, Mary, the Mother of God. Understandably, she's got the most. But and when you study the different types of saints, you'll start to see some interesting patterns. Like since we've been talking about women, there's a lot of sisters. There's a lot of sisters in the catalog. Sisters of famous monks. Sisters. So you can see again the role of Sarah, for instance, in Behnam and Sarah. Brothers and sisters it's like a powerful theme in a lot of the stories of the saints too. But so I encourage you, it's not perfect. There are glitches, but we decided it was more important to get the thing up there, and then people can send us feedback. It's community built. So if ever people wanted to add new entries, we'd be happy to add that. That's the wonderful thing about digital humanities is you can continue to update and revise, and it's free for everyone to use.
Thank you. So this is exciting. How can, there may be a few, volunteers who will be interested in participating in these kinds of projects. Is there an opportunity for them as their high school project or as their, Sunday school project?
Absolutely. We're always looking for collaborators. And there's always new work that could be done. If someone wants to work, if someone's learning Syriac and wants to work on a new translation, for instance, of a saint's life or a homily on a saint, or even just to do a comparative study. I think those can be really wonderful types of studies too, just to look at different types of saints and see patterns in the stories and the people's lives. I like to study how traditions move from place to place too, about the saints. It can, like St. Thomas is a great example. So he's also venerated in Edessa as well as India. So you can see how communities can also join one another through their devotion of the same saint. So you can have families built that way too, or say they each have relics of the different saints.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have been teaching for 11 years in the Department of Theology and focusing primarily on historical theology. You have encountered countless students of varying backgrounds. What is something that you would love about the Syriac literary world that you would like to impart in your students?
Oh, yes. Well, I would say, perhaps, in my opinion, and I think this is something that many of my colleagues would share, the poetic approach that was so masterfully done by the Syrian theologians like St. Ephraim, that is perhaps the most exciting thing to teach because it is so beautiful and so different. It captures my students on this whole other level because it's not a it's a genre which is more best suited for speaking about the mysteries of God, like something like the incarnation, the paradox of the incarnation, that God would love us so much that he would become a man in the person of Jesus Christ. How can you understand it? Well, we can only say what it's like, and we can only praise it and be in great wonder. So that approach of poetry and wonder is, I think, vital. It is vital that my students up here at Marquette, coming from Western traditions, it is vital that they understand that and they learn about that, because it's so exciting and it's so important. And you start to see that there's more than there's a variety of ways for understanding God, and poetry is a very important one. Wonder is a very important one. Not everything has to be explained in philosophical language, for instance. Maybe that doesn't work. Maybe poetry is just as important. So I would say that. But also, it's important that my students know that Christians in the Middle East and in the Orient and India exist, because sometimes they don't even know about that. Absolutely. And that's very important. So for my heart, I should have said this back in the beginning. One of the things that I was really excited about when I got into this field was that there is living heritage of churches as yours. And I wanted to devote myself to my career. I wanted to devote myself to bringing attention, not just to the literature, not just to the theology, but also to the people themselves, and many of whom have suffered terribly. I mean, we don't understand that in our country often. And so I think it's extremely important that the living heritages and the living peoples, that we know about them, and
it's really difficult to convince people in the West that Christianity existed in India, or Christianity is a Middle East religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. Christianity is a religion of the East. Period.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes we say that we are still using the same language that Christ used in our liturgy, like this is how we worship. So
yeah,
cherish
it's
that.
It's beautiful.
Yep.
Yeah. As well, you should.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I mean, and that's frankly why it's such an honor for me to be speaking with you, because this means so much to me that you would ask, that you from your tradition, that I mean, I dare say it can, I experienced a whole new conversion of my heart as a young person when I first got into Syriac studies through studying the Syriac heritage. And so to be connected also to the living church is so important to me. So it's such an honor to speak with you all about that.
Yeah. So to the viewers, if you are interested in learning more about, Dr. SaintLaurent's work, so make sure, the link is posted here. You can have a look at that. You can purchase the book, and there's a lot of materials available. So, if you would like to, know more about her works and, go through the work, this is a great opportunity. And before we conclude, I have one final question. So humor in Syriac hagiography. So that is something that, I saw a paper that you have, you published, like, humor. So can you give us an example before we conclude? Like, so the divine humor you have noticed in the Syriac hagiography.
Yes, I think it's so, I will say I wrote that paper for some context at a very difficult time in my life. My mother was dying, and my mother of blessed memory. And so I was looking to my own sources to find a source of comfort. And I thought there's got to be something about humor in the lives of the saints. And in fact, I found it. And my favorite example is the story of a stylite saint, so another saint who lives on top of a pole in John of Ephesus, and he was called Urho. And so that means short in Syriac. And so he literally was Shorty, the stylite saint. So his name was Shorty, but he stood on top of a pole. And to me, that was an example of humor. I'm sure that we were meant to giggle at that. And yeah. So that's my favorite example, but there's others. Anytime that you have these unexpected things, they're meant to pull us out a little bit and make us scratch our heads. I think that's an example of humor.
Yeah. So do you have, I mean, humor is one way to get into people's mind, and, maybe that's one way to disseminate the love of God as well. So,
Yeah.
do you have any projects in the pipeline? Like, you write about this humor.
I suppose this is kind of funny. My next project is I've been interested in actually the study of vices in Christianity, in early Christianity. And so I'm thinking now I'm going to be writing about eating practices, and in particular, the vice of gluttony in the Syriac tradition. So what it is about what we eat and what we drink, and how that was considered in the ancient world. And it's been actually a really fun project because it's not something that modern people talk about anymore, but in the ancient church it was considered a vice. So I've been looking at that, and it's been very illuminating. So I'll keep you posted on how my gluttony book is going.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have a lecture series on Morphilexinos of Mabug, and so it's a 3 lecture series coming up from next Saturday. So, and the last lecture is on gluttony. Like, Morphilexinos have written a lot of things, and the last one is specifically on gluttony. It's glad that
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a great discourse that Philoxenus wrote on gluttony. Yeah. I'll enjoy that.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's been an hour time. We really enjoyed your presence, and thank you so much for joining us here at Urho.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So
thank you very much. And if anyone ever wants, my email is up online at Marquette University. You can find me in the theology department. Please send me an email if you ever want to correspond about anything.
Thank you. Thank you. God bless your work. May all glory
God bless you.
to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one true God. Amen. Thank you so much.
Amen.
Good night, viewers.
Good night.
Thank you again, Dr. Saint-Laurent.
Good night now. Thank you.